Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ruby Reed. I'm one of the co-founders of Advaya, and I'm very happy to be joining you today on this Halloween Eve, together with legendary feminist historian, land witch, and founder of the Suppressed Histories Archive, Max Dashu, to explore the secret history of the witches. The webinar will run for 60 minutes, and it will consist of a live Q&A between Max and I. But more than anything, the webinar is a beginning and an opening up of this conversation on the Advaya platform around the ancient spiritual heritages of Europe's wise women, seeresses, and healers. We're very excited to be putting together a course with Max on this topic, which will be launched tomorrow. And everyone on the webinar will receive a special discount code and be able to sign up from tomorrow onwards. And the conversation today will take Max's 50 years of research as a starting point to begin to explore the original history of witches, of when they were revered as spiritual leaders and healers, and the pagan European traditions that kept earth-based wisdom alive. So I'm going to hand over to Sophie now, who is going to share a little bit more about Advaya and the Advaya platform.
So as Ruby said, many of you are new to the platform, so we just wanted to introduce Advaya for a few minutes before we get started. So Advaya was established in 2015 by sisters Ruby and Christabel Reed. Since then, it's grown into a leading transformative educational platform with a relational approach to how we understand our worlds. Our mission is to re-enchant people with life so they can heal relationships with themselves, each other, the sacred, and the natural living world. Advaya's global faculty brings together leading visionaries, scientists, spiritual teachers, artists, authors, activists, philosophers, and storytellers. Our programs look to establish relational consciousness in a way that celebrates nature while also creating community, building resilience, healing division, and cultivating clarity of mind. With that said, our commitment is towards transforming our community's relationship with the world around them. Our main offering is our live and on-demand courses, of which we currently have more than 20 available at advaya.life. This amounts to over 5,000 hours of video content spanning topics such as ecology, spirituality, the body, AI, and more. So if it's your first time engaging with us, just know that there's a lot more to discover. So before we jump into today's webinar, we'd also just like to remind you that we'd love to stay in touch. So if you want to co-create our next webinar or course with us, you can contact Ruby or Virginia. And if you'd like to help us spread the word about Advaya in exchange for a kickback, you can contact Olivia. All of their emails, contact information is displayed on the slides. And then, of course, you can always go to our website for more information and resources. So today's webinar topic is situated in a broader conversation within the Advaya learning ecosystem. Some of our most popular topics include hidden histories, mythology, the human-nature connection, and explorations of the female divine. We like to call them curated learning journeys. Some of our other courses on mythology, as you can see, are Dionysus, Rave Ritual and Revolution, Rewilding Mythology, and When Women Were the Land. All taught by leading visionaries such as Joshua Schrey, Sophie Strand, Bayo Komalafe, Chiara Baldini, Sylvia Linstead, and more. You can take any of these courses individually or become a lasting member of the Advaya community, unlocking unlimited access to everything we have to offer. And in the spirit of this webinar, we've created a special Halloween discount, like Ruby said, that is exclusively for you. We'll share more details in the chat shortly. That's it for me. Back to you, Ruby.
Thank you, Sophie. So to get us back to the topic of today, the secret history of the witches, I'm very thrilled to be joined by pioneering researcher of women's history, Max Dashu. Max is the founder of the Suppressed Histories Archives since 1970, through which she has been researching and documenting women's history on a global scale from ancient times to today. Max is an expert in iconography and matricultures, through which she's been exploring the stories of medicine women, witches, and powerful female figures, revealing the impacts of patriarchy and domination. She's written many books and built a collection of over 50,000 images, 100 visual presentations, articles, photo essays, and videos, fleshing out the cultural heritages that have been explored. So more about Max's work can be found on her website, including many links to open access articles that she's written, and there's a huge wealth of knowledge there that I invite you to explore. So welcome, Max. So good to see you.
Thank you.
And so as a way to get us all onto the same page, Max, it would be great if you could share some of your research into the authentic heritage or true history of the witch. Who was she? Where did the concept originate? And who does it refer to? Or what is the relationship between the oracle, wise woman, and the witch?
Yes, yeah. Well, you know, we have to first clear through a whole thicket of misinformation, demonization, the idea of witch as evildoer. You know, there's a whole patriarchal narrative about women of vision and power that has been saturated throughout Western Civ and European dominated colonial societies as well. So we you know, really, we have to look down into what the ethnic folk traditions are. There's like a process for those of European descent of ancestral recovery here to find what was real, what was tribal European culture actually like, and what forms of spiritual leadership did women fulfill inside those societies. So one of the things I've done is investigated names for the witch in those languages. And what we see is not somebody who harms people, but instead the words mean things like knower, seer, dreamer, diviner, prophetess, healer, herbalist, shapeshifter, spirit journeyer. So those attributes have something in common with women all over the planet. You know, the Siberian female shamans or the African Isangoma, there's a lot of similar traits. And what we have to do to uncover this is to go through a very interdisciplinary process of looking at the cultural record, the orature, what the common people said, the proverbs and the stories they passed on, the way that witches were connected to the seasonal festivals, pagan festivals originally. And then, you know, just to find out what the culture said about them at the earliest levels possible. And here's some ironic thing is that the written record is entirely by white men on this subject. And here we're talking about the European witches. The word witch itself is from a root that in Anglo-Saxon either has to do with life force or has to do with seeing and knowing. You know, and this is true in Russian, Vedma, and other names as well. But we find interesting references in the priestly literature because as they were going around Europe trying to stamp out pagan ways, they had interrogatory manuals that they would ask people, is there any woman who, and then they would list, you know, is there any woman who puts lights before the fountains? Is there any woman who gives contraceptive drinks? You know, drinking sterility, they call it. They talk a lot about, and I'm going to get into this in a moment, about offerings, basically land veneration, earth, water, stones, trees. And they connect this to the witches. So these are all things, it's a process of uncovering that we have to go through. And then we have the iconography. And we do see a lot of demonizing images, but it's actually quite striking that even like after 1700, a lot of the paintings that are done of witches, we see them scrying into bowls of water or into lakes. We see them divining through various methods, casting lots. We see them brewing in cauldrons. We see the aspects of healing coming along, and old women as counselors, the wise woman as counselor, the one that carries the cultural wisdom, the culture keepers, in a sense, against a whole wall of priestly opposition that says the only spiritual authority can come from the male. And then you have this subversive folk culture that is just going along. It's conforming at the surface, just not to be messed with by church and state, by the lords or the magistrates. But underneath, they love this culture and they keep it going. And all of the proverbs about women spinning near the hearth and the ceremonies of the hearth and the offerings that are made to herbs before gathering them. This is all part of a body of culture that was conserved very stubbornly by the common people. That's where the core tradition of it lies.
So thank you, Max. So just to clarify that a little bit, like something that comes up in my mind when you're talking is this idea of like a multiplicity of worldviews and ways of being, but that there has been a dominant story, which is the one that's been passed down, which is the one held by the priestly cultures and the ones that had the power of the voice and the voice that we now hear. And when you're talking about the folk culture, how much is the culture around the witch and the wise woman the lived experience of people of the time, rather than like an exceptionality of the moment?
Yeah, it's something that we really have to look at the orature, at things that were written down, people recorded. The Grimm brothers in Germany and other places went around, folklorists gathering this lore. And so the testimony comes to us through these mediators who sometimes, superimpose their own perspectives. But that's really one of the best sources we have for the authentic testimony directly from the culture and the customs that were carried out. And a lot of times, I call this all part of the witch tradition. Sometimes these people have been Christianized, so they don't necessarily think about it in those terms. What we have to look at, though, is the continuity from the pagan period before Christianization. And then there's the Roman Empire and there's state religion. And so there's this whole process, and not to leave out this persecution by iron and fire that was the witch hunts that went on for 1,000 years. It wasn't just the period of the mass terror against these folk leaders, but it was things that began in the early Middle Ages as they tried to stamp out what they called paganism, but it was really just the old ethnic religions and their natural philosophies.
Thank you. I wanted to ask some more questions, but I feel like you have some slides.
I would like to share some images because I think it'll give people a taste a little more of when I say authentic, what I'm talking about, is to really look in detail rather than generalizing with the, we need to theorize about this. I'm not saying that, but here I'm looking at, for example, this is a painting by a Finnish artist in the 1800s from the Kalevala, and the old witch mother Ilmatar is actually considered to be such a powerful healer that she is able to bring her son back to life after gathering together his body parts. And he's showing these rays with the bee bringing vitality down from the sun. And, so we have healing with stones. We have all kinds of different symbols that are being transmitted. So in the course that we're proposing to do, there's basically 6 sections, and then, of course, one for open discussion, that we look at legendary and historic witches. I'm just going to kind of go through these. So the legendary witches, this is folk lore about women who were symbolic figures, not necessarily historic figures, but who stood for, in this case, the Norse seeress, who went from house to house, making the saved trance, going into ecstasy and prophesying as a cultural authority. In Ireland, there's many examples, but Monfin is a really interesting one because she is associated specifically with Samhain, the holiday that we're about to celebrate. Here it's anglicized as Samhain Tide, but they call it the Festival of Monfin. And they say that she was once a living witch, but now she's a spirit. And what's interesting is on this hallowed eve, women and the common people address their petitions to her. So there's this connection of witchcraft with the commoners, which runs through everything. And it also connects to tribal Europe. So in the Czech tradition, and here again, I'm talking about ethnic, specifically, in this case, Slavic traditions, we have the 3 witch sisters, Libusha, Kazi, and Teta. And one is a prophetess, the other is an herbalist, and the other is a priestess. And so this is a modern painting once again, but we see her with the bundle of birch, which is sacred so much, especially through the Slavic world. And I go into this when we talk about the sweat lodges. And so she's a prophetess. She actually founds Prague. So she's a historic figure that is mythologized. And we can read this through Roman sources and other kinds of, elite male testimony about the Germans, that women were considered to have prophetic insight and were listened to. And this is a picture, a very romanticized picture of Weleda, who was a prophetess of the Bructeri tribe that led a revolt against the Roman Empire. So we've got these political elements coming in. Here's a Dutch example, and this is from the 1600s, as you can see. But the old megalithic mounds, they're showing an ancestral woman emerging from this mound to prophesize, and we have people paying reverence. So these are testimonies of very old forms of ancestral culture that continued along even to that late period. And then I referred earlier to the names of the witch. And so when we look into these ethnic languages, we have words that mean seeress and wise woman and wise woman. And we have libistra, which could be translated Anglo-Saxon as medicine woman, or herb woman, or woman who chants over the herbs, or woman who casts lots, visionaries, all kinds of different woman who speaks prophecy, knower. And so looking through this, it tells us things about the cultural practices and the women that were considered to be spiritual leaders in these societies. And so we go from Proverbs out of Ireland, or seeress, who has what they call second sight, or knowledge of the raven's head. And there are Proverbs talking about women listening to the ravens who are associated with the goddess Morrigan and receiving knowledge from them. And we have this one writing, it's a penitential book translated from Latin 1,000 years ago into Old English. And it talks about the veneration of land, the stones and trees and the well springs. And he adds an editorial comment. It's not in the original text. Swa wicken tacha, as the witches teach. And what this shows us is the witch, A, is regarded as a teacher, as a spiritual authority, and that her reverence is for the sacredness of nature. And so this is animacy in its fullest form. So we can go through cultural artifacts, and this is what I believe is the oldest image of the three fates, the Weird Sisters, as they're called in Britain, that we have from the 700s. And I actually use this for the cover of my book, which is intended to be a source book on recovering these traditions. But then we have other sections in the course that we'll look at that will be about wands, cauldrons, and crystal balls. So these you could think of, we know these from fairy tales. But what's striking is that we can go back into the archaeological record and see that there are actual burials of women who are, traditions about the brewing of herbs in the cauldron, for example, out of the Welsh side, the cauldron of Caradwyn, or from the Breton side across the channel in Celtic France, the 9 Gaulish priestesses who also simmer elixirs of immortality in their cauldron, but are also weather makers and are shapeshifters, healers to an incredible degree, and foreknowers. And so this cauldron of the witches is very, very ancient. We see it already with the Greeks talking about the Colchian goddess, then priestess, then witch, Medea, and again, the power to restore from death. But there's also archaeological finds of crystal balls from women's belts and burials in different parts of mostly Western Europe, but even in Hungary. And these are connected also with sieves that were used as pendulums in divination. And we see this continuing on into modern times, especially in Eastern Europe. And then the witch's wand, the staff, which was called vur in Old Norse. And the witches were called vulva, which means staff women. And so we have these amazing staves that survived in women's burials. And these are a bunch of examples of actual witches' wands in iron, the wooden ones mostly dissolved into dust. But they were symbolically distaffs. This area at the top, this is where the flax was wrapped around for spinning. So we see the witch's wand is also a spinner's wand, the distaff. And so in burials of women in Sweden, they're buried with their wand in their hands, or they're riding on it like a hobby horse, like a broomstick. And this is something that European tradition shares with the North Asians in Siberia, where the shamans also ride on horse-headed staves. And we can look into the orature of Iceland, in the Vulvaspa, which means the seeress's prophecy, Odin comes to the vulva and asks her for wisdom. And you can see her, she's doing what they call utiseka, sitting out on the land for vision and for power. And the artist here, I love this Danish artist, put the cauldron in there, but you see the nature all around her, and she's sitting on the stone, and she's actually holding one of these staves, these distaff-shaped wands. So there are various Icelandic epics that talk about seeresses like Thorbjörg that go around from village to village prophesying. And then we have a whole section on herbal wisdom and the healers. And there's quite a bit of both from folklore, but also from the old written text. And again, here we're talking about monks mostly that are writing this down in the Lachnunga in 900s England, which has the 9 herbs charm. And these are incantations to herbs as beings. The mugwort, foremost amongst them, oldest of herbs. And the way that mugwort in Europe, as in China, as in North America, the Artemisia family is all used for clearing away negative energy. So there are these connections to be drawn, and the smudging. So you see Native people in North America doing this, but it was also practiced in Europe. And so all these traditions of the healers, and not just the medicines they used, but the ways they gathered them and the incantations, the charms that they sang or that they spoke while healing. So we're looking at holistic healing in these traditions. And then there's the whole story of the witch's goddess, because the idea that women who go by night with the goddess is something that begins to appear in priestly writings in the 900s. And they say that the common people believe in this, and 1/3 of the world is engaged in these spiritual traditions, according to one bishop. And so the witch's goddess gradually gets turned into the devil by the theologians. But the early text, here we've got one from Western Germany. You can see the year there. And he's calling them evil women who go with Diana by night. And then a little bit later in Italy, and again, this is all diabolical error according to these men, but he's telling us many people revered Diana or Herodias, whom they call queen, or rather goddess. And so here you've got this 1/3 of the world. And there's a lot we could say about that. So Herodias is a figure from the Bible who somehow gets fused in with the witch's goddess, who is engaged in sacred dance. She has the holy tree with the serpent, cornucopias pouring out good things, garlands, people worshiping her, dancing upon a stone. There are all these little hints. This is from the 800s in the Netherlands. And so there are these little traces through coming here as well of the goddess as a fateful spinner. And so she's got these strands of spun fiber that she's working with, but she has the herbs there in cornucopias on her laps. And then finally, also, what about the witch hunts that went on for so many centuries, targeting primarily women, and the diabolical ideologies that were used to describe this and really fuel this persecution, the way that the theologians and the professors and the doctors, and especially the judges, the inquisitors, but also the Protestants, used iron and fire torture trials to impose this ideology of the diabolical witch, their own pornographic demonologies. And what effect has that had on women of European descent, or any cultures affected by these ideologies, because they were exported under the colonial order. So that's just a little taste of some of the visuals that I'm working with, and we'll of course be discussing a lot of this in more detail. And so I'm going to just leave it with that and kick it back over to Ruby.
Thank you, Max. When you share those slides and images and the insight into the spiritual heritage and cultural heritage of the witch and the wise woman in Europe, I'm so moved by the role that they were playing within their communities and as these very powerful figures, and also very moved by what happened with the subsequent persecutions and the trauma that was then occurring through history over the last millennia and more. And then thinking about the time of year that we're in now with Halloween. And before we started the call, we were talking about the like eroticization and romanticization of the witch, and the irony of that again. And it's like a double persecution in a way. That was the original persecution, and there's a double persecution now happening in culture and literature. And I wonder, when we're thinking about reclaiming the witch and reclaiming this concept, how do you feel that we should go about this, and how should we engage with the witch properly, with reverence and respect, as the wise women and seer that you speak about?
Yes. Yeah, I think that, it's really crucial to understand how land-based all of this was. This very strong connection with nature, with sanctuaries of nature. And we can see that even in the narratives that the priesthood constructed about the witches. But it's really about digging back into this is what I tried to do in my book, Witches and Pagans, was to uncover whatever I could from the written record or from folk orature, the oral tradition that spoke to these issues, spoke to individual cultures where they're talking, in Italy, in, Czechoslovakia, or any of these places, what their ideas about the witches were. And you often see an overbleed, witches and goddess, witches and fairies, and the whole thing about the fairy faith. Because if you look, Evans Wentz did an amazing book about this. I think it's called the Fairy Faith in Celtic Lands. And he shows that this was actually ancestor veneration. That they saw the fairies as the spirits of the dead. This was a very important aspect of it. And he documents this not just by his own theory, but quotes from people that he interviewed in Scotland and the Isle of Man and Britannia, different places. So there are a lot of connections of the witch to goddesses or to the female divine that are really important. And this, of course, gets torqued through the pens and the mouths of the priesthood, who try to make Diana into the devil. And they use Diana as kind of a catch-all term. The Interpretatio Romana, everything has to go through Latin. But, in Germany, you have Holla and Perchta. And in Scotland, you have the Queen of Elfame, or, various different names in Ireland. And, Anya, for example, is associated with the Midsummer Eve processions, and they're carrying the clears, and you have these torches. And so these folk religions, these folk rituals are very much the core tradition. And so we have to try to reconnect the seers and the woman of vision with all of that, thinking about the old women as cultural authorities, which they were. They were the ones who knew. And you have this generational passing on. Sometimes the names change because they are in flight. They're being pursued by the confessors and the priests and the ministers and the inquisitors. And so the names for the goddesses shapeshift. They can't say Diana anymore in Italy, so they start to call the witch's goddess instead La Signora del Gioco, the lady of play. And so there are all these pseudonyms that begin to circulate around them. I don't know if I've totally lost touch with the question you were asking. I mean, there's so many directions to explore in this. But, we could look, for example, at folk rituals of divination, and the kinds of things that were done. For example, on Samhain Eve, on All Hallows Eve, as it was Christianized to be called, you have Scottish women sowing yarrow seeds. And then as they sow them, they say a charm, and they're supposed to look over their shoulder and find out who their future husband will be. Because, of course, marriage is considered to be most indicative of what women's fate is going to be like in patriarchal societies. And I want to say these are not matriarchal societies, but it is matriculture. There are elements of matriculture that were retained in this esteem for the knowledge of uneducated old women. They were looked down, they were at the bottom of the social order, the common peasant woman. And yet they held very faithfully to things that had their great, 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 great grandmothers had done. whether it's the ceremonies of spinning, and there's a whole connection between spinning and weaving. I talk about this in my book, and witchcraft. The idea, for example, in the Norse world, that women would spin while chanting an incantation, and this would bring things about. It was very much the witch in the image of the fate, or of weird, as they would say in English tradition. And there are words for all of this in all the different languages. So the witch's goddess is an important piece, and we have to disentangle that from all the demonization that took place through the Inquisition and through the witch trials that followed that. And another angle to this is the sexual politics of the witch. So at a very early period in the penitential books, we have the priesthood saying, these terrible women, they're committing homicide because they're giving women diabolical drinks that cause them not to conceive. And according to these theologians, women's whole purpose on earth is to be baby machines. And, that's what you're here for. And so how dare you have control over your own progeneration, right? And so this original meme that begins in 5th century, we see Caesarius of Arles, who was a bishop in southern France, calling it homicide for women to cause the blood to flow again, to give amenagogue drinks to women so that they will not carry a pregnancy, that they would have some control. Maybe they already have 9 children. This is a real, it's an issue of starvation in many cases. So those old codes are then evolved by the theologians over hundreds and hundreds of years into the meme of the witch as baby killer. And this is an aspect of the blood libel that we see applied against the Jews, saying that they had terrible ceremonies where they killed a Gentile boy, and are later exported and applied against Native people in charges of cannibalism, and all because they are, quote unquote, heathen savages.
Mm.
So there's a lot of connections to be drawn to the way that the repression that was directed, against the ethnic folk cultures of Europe in the process of Christianization, and B, against the women who were primary authorities in those traditions, the witches, or whatever, by whatever name we want to call them, the priestesses, the oracles, the dreamers. Those persecutions eventually result in an export of an ideology of devil worship, that all American, African, Pacific Island religions are devil worship. And this gives us, through the papal bull and the doctrine of discovery, an excuse to enslave and seize the lands of all these peoples and become rulers over them. So there's those connections to be known.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
When you speak about the witch, and you speak about the way that the witch was working with natural forces, with land, with medicine, then there was a sense of autonomy and leadership that she held, sovereignty over her body and of the bodies of people that she was working with in the land that she was working with. And you frame it as though this was the threat to the patriarchy or the dominant forces of the time. But when we think about the witch persecutions, often they're associated with like early modern, like 1600s, 1700s. But from your research, it's shown in what you've just mentioned now that they originated much, much earlier.
Yes.
And I'd love you to share a little bit about that history of the persecutions and how they arose and what happened there with that history.
Right. So like, there's, in the early Middle Ages, there were witch burning laws that went on the books in Spain, France, England, between like 600, 500 and the 1100 or so. And we don't have any records from those periods. There's no court records. There's no trial records. We can't see it. We can only see the laws. In some cases, they were using ordeals where women had to walk on or carry hot iron for a certain number of paces to determine whether or not they were guilty of witchcraft. So this is in the Spanish fueros. This is in, the laws of various Germanic kings. And so we have that going on. I tried to document in one of the chapters in Witches and Pagans, early witch burnings, because in academia, there was a reaction against the idea that the witch hunts happened in the Middle Ages. And there was some validity to that, because the main persecution, what I call the witch hunting terror, took place after 1400, right? And it went on for a bunch of centuries. But there were persecutions in the 1100s. We have women being thrown off, and not even necessarily burned, but thrown off to drown off the London Bridge, in the 11th century. We have examples of women being drowned for witchcraft in Germany. We have burnings happening by city authorities, and sometimes not only burnings, but brandings, exiles, fines, shunning, all kinds of other lower level persecution were also going on. And what we see happening is that with the foundation of the Inquisition in the early 1200s, they reauthorized judicial torture, which had been a thing in Roman law and even in Greek law before that. And so that really blew the whole thing up because they were forcing people to denounce others, right? Okay, who were the witches that were with you at the witches' gathering? And, some women died rather than, just incredibly courageous and being able to withstand the horrific tortures that they underwent. And others, we're human beings, you just can't stand it anymore. And so they would give the denunciations that were sought, and the whole thing would geometrically explode in scale. So that's when we get the mass hunts. But the very important piece that I think is crucial to understanding this is the way that the theologians go from the early medieval framing of witches worship devils, especially female devils like quote unquote Diana, to a demonological ideology. And we're talking about Thomas Aquinas and his ideas about succubi, but also the earlier slides I showed you where they're talking about women who go by night with Diana. There evolves a mythology of witches who fly abroad on the pagan holidays, first with a goddess, but then increasingly, at least in the minds of the male theologians, with the devil, because the goddess is the devil. This is what they're trying to put through. And so this becomes the mythology of persecution, that in the torture chambers, the accused are being forced to parrot back and to say who was with them at these gatherings. And the whole mythology is built around an idea that witches had these gatherings and they had bonfires and they had feasts and they danced. So it's basically in the image of the pagan folk festivals, whether it's the Midsummer's Eve or Samhain or any of the other, even the full moon. And they would journey to places that were considered sacred, like the highest peak in Scotland. So the Scottish witches are going with Nickniven, the old crone goddess. Her name actually means the daughter of Ben Nevis, and they're going there to celebrate the witches' ceremonies. In Italy, it's La Noche di Benevento, the tree of Benevento in Campania. And this becomes something that is not only in the folklore since about the year 700, this evergreen tree that the witches used to dance around, the pagans at that time period. But in the witch trials of the 1600s, people are being forced to say, yes, we and all the witches rode to Benevento, and there we danced around the walnut tree of the witches. So there's this weird conflation of completely made up diabolical fantasies on the part of the persecutors, but using elements from the authentic witch tradition or the folk tradition, let's say. And so that gives us the shape of the persecutions. But of course, the other part is the political aspect of it, and that's the misogyny. The idea that women's power is illegitimate. The authors of the Malleus Maleficarum are saying, women are naturally inferior, they're carnal. Of course, there's a whole body of mythology about witches having sex with the devil, that women are being forced in the torture chamber to repeat back. And the torture does not stop until they talk about the devil and how his member was cold and how they were raped by the devil. And so, the interrogators are getting off on this. And for us in modern times, we have to think about this also as something that indelibly magnetized European culture to a dominance-based sexuality. So when we think about like the bondage themes, and dungeons and tying women up and all of these things, they are actually reflections of historic trauma and cultural legacies that have never been chains. All of that stuff have never been addressed, much less overturned. Right. So these themes, these emotional ties to very deeply patriarchal narratives are something that is still very present in modern culture.
Yeah, thank you, Max, for making that comparison. Very, very evident and very chilling. When you speak about your research and the paper documents and the sources that you're looking at, so much of that will be misinformation and censorship or propaganda. And I wonder how you carry out your research and how you've managed to amass so many images and so much, such a vast archive, and how you rebuild these stories. Because I imagine there's a lot of immersing yourself and having to piece things together and trying to reimagine.
That's right. And piece it together is good because in a way it's like taking a mosaic. There's this piece and this piece and this piece, and how do they relate to each other? There's an element of pattern recognition. There's another element of being able to basically decipher through the bias of our sources and see what underlies it. You know, they're all calling it devil worship. So we already know that bias is there. But then we're seeing, like, for example, there's a witch, well, a woman healer who was tried by the Inquisition in mid-16th century Italy, Bellezza Orsini. And in the torture chamber, she's saying, no, I'm a healer. I take olive oil and I put into it chopped flowers and leaves from all kinds of flowering plants. And I cure this, and it's a flower oil of mine that I use to cure every type of diseases and injuries, you know. And this is something the Italian women were really into, the olive oil ointments and salves, and they would gather them on Ascension Day. So there's Catholicized elements to it. But the Inquisitor was trying to force her to say that she's in league with the devil. And she withstands 3 rounds on the strappado, where they tie your arms on behind your back and they hoist you up and they drop you down. So they're dislocating your shoulders, and it's agonizing. And she finally realizes that, you know, she's trying to tell a story that will somehow keep her integrity. And she's saying, well, yes, the devil tries to control the witches, but we're really in the service of Befana, and the goddess tries to help us resist the devil. So she's constructing her own integrity in the torture chamber. But she realizes they're never going to stop until she gives them what they want, and she refuses to say those things. And so she kills herself in a prison cell. You know, so that's an example of the resistance that comes through to us from the Inquisitor's own transcript of the interrogation. And so, you know, that's an example of reading through. You can see that Befana is a divinity, you know, associated with the Feast of the Epiphany. That's where the name comes from. But in the Italian folk tradition, they have this female deity who is their protector, and the one that they're seeking, you know, inspiration and healing and all the rest from, who they're invoking, in fact. So we have to be able to read through the biases of the sources. And sometimes you just get a few facts out of them. You know, you're going to get a date and a place. You're going to get the stories they told, and it will have to do with terrible crimes and, you know, killing babies and making ointments out of their fat, using daturas and other kinds of herbs that are known to have psychoactive properties. But it's all getting brewed up into a mishmash of accusation. And I think the historical records we have, whether they're from chroniclers or whether they're from theologians or whether they're from judges, have to also be weighed against what folk tradition will tell us about actual beliefs. And so that's where the orator comes in. And there's a lot of authors. A lot of this stuff is not available in English. I mean, there's an incredible body of Italian scholarship about the witch's goddess and the folk practices, the ceremonies that she was associated. Sapiente Sibilia, the wise Sibyl. So they deified the ancient Cumaean Sibyl, and how she teaches seekers who go to her cave in the Apennine Mountains all the mysteries of life. Then we can look at the Balkans. And so an author like Eva Poch has got just an incredible amount. She's written several books, numerous articles that tell us about the fairy faith in the Balkan world and how this is associated with the witches and the ceremonies and holidays and practices that they engaged in. So what I'm trying to get at is that it's a process of synthesis from a lot of really disparate sources. And it's like, where do they come together? And where do they affirm in some way what each other are saying? So that we see the bias of the priesthood, but then on the other hand, they are telling us real things, and they're even writing down traditions about the tree of Benevento, for example, and how it stood along the shore of the Dianas. So I had to do a lot of reading, and it's just an ongoing process of gathering this all. And then over time, you begin to, like, I was not really initially concerned with ancestor reverence. But as time went on, I began to see parallels in the European tradition with what was going on in Africa or Native North America, as far as communion with ancestors is concerned. And other things as well, because, for example, in Europe, we also had sweat houses. Whether we're talking about the Tach and Alish in Ireland, or whether we're talking about the Bojina in Russia, or even in Portugal, where there are actually carved stones called the pretty stones in Galician and Portuguese that were entrance ways to the sweat house chamber. And in some cases, in order to go through that little opening, just like a Native American sweat lodge, very low opening to keep the heat in, you have to pass between the open legs of a goddess, a very abstract goddess figure. So there are a lot of connections to be found.
Thank you, Max. There's if someone wanted to start to explore some of the practices that are associated with the witch or the wise woman, how could someone go around that? Have you got this on your website or in your books? Or perhaps you could share a little bit more about the types of practices that the witch was engaged in.
Sure. I do describe a lot of what I found, at least for the period, the early Middle Ages is the focus of my book, although I do drip over the edges on that. But for example, there is something called waking the well. And this does not mean waking up the well. It means staying awake all night in vigil beside a spring or a fountain all night long. And so there is it's actually from a war epic of the Anglo-Saxons in the 11th century. And this guy describes how he sees these women leaving the house in the middle of the night and going down to the water. And he follows them. And they're sitting there and they're holding dialogues in the night with the spirit of the fountain. This is all in Latin, right? Custos fontium. And so they're saying things, they're asking questions, and then they're listening and they're getting answers. So this is something that comes, it's coming to a slant because the whole story that's being told is about the life story of some warrior. And yet there's this little sidebar piece about these women who are being creepily spied upon by this guy. But, this is what they're doing. And there are, what other kinds of examples? One is, and this again is that the ceremonial practices at birth. So either goddesses or sometimes the three fairies, the three fates, the fairy godmothers, our offerings are made to them. And so you have French poems in the 12th, 13th century that are talking about these three sisters who come during the night, and people have laid out an offering table with plates and three knives for these fatas so that they will destine good things to those who are born there. So these are birth practices. And I should mention that not only the Malleus Maleficarum targets midwives as especially prone to witchcraft. So what we're seeing really there is ceremonial practices around birth, the bathing of the child. And the priests saw this as a theft of their sole right to baptism, but the women had been doing this long before Christianity ever came. And so the bathing of the child and the singing over the child and the blessing of the child, all kinds of customs, maybe even smoking the child with mugwort, all of those things we can see in the background, and folklorists like Jacob Grimm or Francis Billot have recorded examples of this in different parts of Europe. So there are survivals of these things that we see attested in medieval texts that are still going on in places like Normandy in France, northern France, in the 19th century. So there are these little pockets of culture where those ceremonies are still being practiced. But with the demonologists, getting back to the Malleus and another earlier text that's called the Vaudrey de Lyon in the 1440s or so, even before the Malleus, they're talking about witches performing ceremonies over babies. And how diabolical the witches are, because they are calling on devils and they're consecrating the babies to devils. So these devils are really, say in this, for example, the Scandinavian context, they were still chanting to Freya at births, to Frigg. They're calling on the old goddess of their ancestors to protect the mother and child in this dangerous passage from the vastness into material form. So those customs become very much a target of the penitential book writers, of the sermons, scolding priests saying, don't do these things. And they associate them with devils, they associate them with witchcraft, anything they can to basically smear it as something you should stay well away from. And over time, I would put the 1390s as the breaking point. And it varies. The timing varies across different parts of Europe, because the witch burnings are much later, say in Eastern Europe, than they are in the area of the Western Alps, for example. But the consensus and the unity of the common people was broken around that time, because the priests began to actually convince people that witches did want to harm them, were devil worshippers. There was this dangerous new sect that had been invented by the theologians, the demonologists, and that people had better watch out, because the witches are going to cause your horse to fall and break its leg, or, cause disease in your fields, or murrain in your cattle, or, the death of your babies. And so in an era of very high infant mortality, we see witches being blamed for children dying. We see midwives, in particular, the old wisewomen, who were doing the best they could under really bad conditions and septic conditions at that, or malnutrition, that it was these old women's fault, and nothing to do with the fact that people were starving, and that there were these plagues going around. Somehow natural phenomena were now to be blamed on women. And this is something else that's very relevant to us now, is the way that hateful scapegoating is a way to motivate people to act against their own interests. We do have examples. One of the Italian sources I read referred to something very important, which was in the Western Alps, where the inquisitors were beginning to really ravage all through the 1400s. In the early 1518, the common people rose up against the Inquisition. They had a revolt, because, people were being hauled out of the mountain villages and brought down to Torino or wherever to be tried as witches. And the people still at that time saw, this is wrong. This is not a good thing. This is an injustice. And the torture, of course. And so they fought back. But eventually the peasant revolts each failed. And we're left with disempowered people who are in pain and don't know what to do. And it becomes very easy to blame the witches for everything that goes wrong. It's because that old woman over there looked at me with a funny look, or she muttered under her breath, maybe because he insulted her. We don't even have the full story of all of this. And so then the scapegoating, and this was going on against Jews as well, of course, and Roma people. But the scapegoating mechanism builds its force, and it is added to by the torture trials. Because not only what goes on secretly inside of the torture chamber, but then when the woman is brought up on the scaffold and is about to be burned, they offer her the grace of being strangled instead of burning alive, if she will simply repeat her confession before the assembled populace. And many did. So then people said, well, you heard her. She said she did it. And they're not even thinking about how she came to speak that way.
Thank you, Max. It's such a privilege and an honor to hear you speak, and I'm really excited for the course that we're going to put together, and very grateful for everyone who's joined us live. 250 people on the call right now, and 2,000 people signed up. So that feels like a really good start. And I feel that this evening of all evenings of the year is the perfect time to start to think about how we reclaim the concept of the witch and venerate the idea of the wise woman within our culture and within our own lives and in our community. So thank you so much for your 50 years of work so far with the Suppressed Histories Archives, and thank you for collaborating with us as Advaya, and thank you to everyone that's joined. Like, obviously we didn't ask any of the group questions just because there's so many, and hope that you'll join for the course for a much deeper experience with Max and to ask all of these questions directly. Some of the questions were specifically around like further reading and resources. So in the follow-up email, we'll do our best to include some links to places where you can find more about this on Max's website, like the question around the three sisters, question around the vulva, question around the amniotic fluid and the long nail. There's lots of this type of question. So we can put that in the follow-up email if we can access some of those links. But just a huge thank you again to Max and to everyone here, and we'll send out the link to sign up to the course for those that are interested, and you can always write to us for more information as well in the meantime. So thank you.
And thank you to the women of Advaya, and happy Halloween, blessed Samhain to everyone.
Blessed Samhain. Goodbye.